Deputy Speaker, thank you. I am so disappointed to be here today. And I'm so disappointed because we've missed an opportunity to provide services that meet the needs for rural and regional Australia. And I have to say the politicking of this policy, connecting core funding responsibilities of childcare to welfare cuts, splitting the bills in the Senate, then the reintroduction, is even more disappointing. To me, it's a clear sign that someone in the system, someone in the government, is missing the point. And while I commit to continue to work with the government and departmental staff and with service providers, people like Anne Bowler and Rod Wayman, they will continue to deliver services in our community, and we will make the best of this. But what it really clearly shows is that there's no overarching policy for rural and regional Australia about how we should be treated. And as a result, we are working backwards. We are playing catch-up. We're trying to fit policy to the needs of particular communities, and we're failing. So, in addressing my comments today, I specifically would like to call into this House the Senator Birmingham. Today, Senator Birmingham has had a letter published in my local paper, the Wangaratta Chronicle, and I'd like to actually use some of his comments to refute his arguments. So to Senator Birmingham, I'm looking forward to you watching and reading this talk and telling me where I've got it wrong. Telling me where I got it wrong because I'm not politically grandstanding. I'm not here for any other purpose than to represent my community. And I'm here because you came to our community. Together with me, you listened to everything my community had to tell you. We've met with your staff. We've met with the Labor Party, we've met with government, we've met with all the crossbenchers. We've put hundreds of hours into this particular topic. We have given it everything we had. Because what we wanted to say to you is there are problems and we could work together to fix them up. And we had great trust in the beginning that you would actually listen to what we had to say. And when you came to Wodonga and spoke to the TV cameras and said, "Trust us, it'll work out," we really wanted to believe you. But sadly, we're back in the parliament today. We're back with the original bit of legislation we started with. So there was an opportunity to try the whole process again, to remove our amendments, to go through all the work that we did a couple of weeks ago with the omnibus legislation. But we're not going to do that. We're going to call it a loss, a really sad loss. And calling it a loss will be gracious and we'll work together to make it work better. And I give you my commitment, and to all the government here, that we will do everything we possibly can as independents never to be in this situation again. And we will focus 100% of our time on getting a really decent policy on rural and regional Australia, a policy that commits to deliver comprehensive services that meet our needs. We've learned our lesson on this single issue, and we won't be going here again. But let me address your specific points, if I could, Senator. The Turnbull government's early childhood education and care reforms have been comprehensively designed with regional Australia in mind. Well, that's good to know. So when we put up, amendments to this House so that we could test the logic of that, they were knocked down by your government, 70 to 72. Your government was not prepared to actually back this up by getting the statistics that would come back and show us that that had worked. So I ask you to reconsider those amendments in the Senate. Come back to the House in 6 months, 12 months' time and show us that it's worked. Because frankly, I don't believe they will. Minister, you said that families in the cities, in regional centres and in the bush know that our early childhood education and care system is not working for them. Well, we all agree with that. We would like a system that did work for us. And we agree with your statistics. The system of mobile childcare as it's been funded, or budget-based funding services, absolutely needs reform. But the sad thing is we don't think you're reforming it in the way that's going to work. You say in your letter that many of the services in regional and rural areas are part of a scheme set up 40 years ago that limits the amount of funding that can be got from the government and stops them from growing to support families. Well, interestingly, Minister, my community tells me exactly the same problems are built into this legislation. It's a grant-based process, limited to a maximum of 5 years. It doesn't allow for new services to be instigated into the long term. So we believe that many of the problems in the initial program are running out again. So I'd be very keen to have your department staff and you tell me how this system is avoiding that, because everybody in my community tells me not so. You talk about the plans that the government has got. You talk about rather than reduce support, we plan to increase it and provide more opportunities for services to respond to changing in their communities. You talk about we're supporting services into a new model of funding that targets increased support towards those families working the most and earning the least, while our childcare safety net, otherwise known as our grants program, worth $1 billion, will help services that might not be otherwise eligible, like some mobile education and care services in regional and rural communities. That's great, but the thing is it's going to be not policy-driven, not needs-based. We're going to have to apply for grants. Now, Minister, you've told me that there'll be a designated amount of money out of that $1 million that we can apply for, but it still will be short-term. It won't be enabling us to build the workforce and the capacity that we need in our rural communities. And I need to say here what makes it special about rural communities is we don't have childcare centres. And because we don't have childcare centres, most of the service, which is designed for centre-based care, is not relevant to us. So the subsidies don't apply, and if we can't get the grant, we don't have a service. Or if we haven't got the people in the community to apply for a grant, we don't have the service. So, Minister, you said in the letter to the Chronicle, firstly, the services will have access to the childcare subsidy. Well, that's no good if we haven't got childcare. And this will allow growth in funding per child for the first time. Well, sure it would, if you had a childcare centre. But if you're in a town like if you live in the towns that I live in, we don't have childcare centres. So the subsidy is irrelevant for us. And for you printing that in the paper as if it works is so wrong. And third, you say they'll have access to the $110 million Community Childcare Fund. I beg your pardon. That's the fund and the grants. So, I beg your pardon, I just made a mistake around the childcare safety net, but that's the fund, and that's not going to be, that's just so limited, and it's nowhere near going to meet the demand we're going to have to provide childcare for the particular groups that I care about, which are farming families and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. And let me say, it's not just me that says this is not going to work. It's Fiona Stanley, who is Australian of the Year, got on the phone really upset about the changes that you're going to make. So she's not convinced that you've got it right. I'm not convinced you've got it right. My community's not convinced you've got it right. So you keep telling us that we've got it right, but you haven't come forward and said how will our rural and farming families be able to create new services that last for the next 20, 50, 100 years, which is what our city sisters will be able to have access to. They'll have services that work. So there clearly are things about this package that are good. They are really good if you're town-based, if you've got access to a service. They're no good if you live in the country and you don't have access to a service. And the changes to the funding, no one's saying will work. Minister, you also talk about we will remove red tape that currently stops childcare services from operating on certain days or for limited hours, which will also help rural and regional Australia. Oh yeah, for sure, if you've got a service. But if you haven't got a service, what do? You apply for a grant, if you can get it, for 1 or 2 or 3 years. You're not instigating a mainstream service into our communities. And you finish off, overall official analysis shows that our reforms are set to benefit around 1 million families across the country. Well, we've got no argument about that. What we're saying is how are you going to make sure that in the long term our farming and Aboriginal families have access to the services? Your letter goes on. You talk about the amendments recently suggested are already addressed through the package and are unfortunately more about political grandstanding than supporting Australian families. Well, we couldn't see it there in the package. We can't see how the things that we've asked for are addressed. You talk about the guidelines. The guidelines aren't in existence yet. The guidelines will have to be drawn up after this legislation is passed. And of course we're happy to input into the guidelines and we will try and make them work. But guidelines are not legislation. They don't actually force whichever government's here in Parliament to do what it needs to be doing. It's a matter of trust us and we'll look after you. Well, we didn't want to do that. We actually wanted to make sure that the changes that you've promised deliver what your government said they would do, and that you must report back to Parliament on how they're going. And it's true, Minister, that you say you have provided me with the information, but none of it has satisfied me. It's true that you say you will continue to engage and speak with me and hope that we will appreciate how our changes will make childcare more affordable, accessible and flexible for Australian families. Well, sadly, I'm not convinced. And I'm not convinced because the people in my community are not convinced. I'm not convinced because people come to my door and say, Cathy, this is not going to work. Can you go to Parliament and represent us? I'm not convinced because the experts in my community have asked me as their representative to come forward and make their case. We've lost. This legislation will go through the House today, it will go through the Senate, and I'm sure that there will be some really good outcomes from it, and we will continue to work. And I'd now like to move my closing comments to say how we could have done this better, how we actually could have made this work. And the little bit of my conversation that I'm really wanting to talk about is the opportunity that the minister has and the government has to work with the regional ministerial task force. So if I could just bring my final comments here to finish on what I hope is an optimistic note. I'm really pleased to see that there's 5 Liberal members of this task force. There are 3 Nats. That there's some very key people, including the minister, for this particular legislation. So it's a positive step. I'm really hoping that you can work as a ministerial task force to look at childcare, to look at transport, to look at telecommunications, to look at education, to look at our young people, to look at how we operate in rural and regional Australia and bring it into a whole, so that we don't have to come here to the Parliament every single time and fight the same battles to say childcare is not working for us, public transport is not working for us, the NBN's not working for us, changes to higher education weren't working for us. It's just so time-consuming and it lacks vision. So what we're hoping is with the regional minister's task force, it will take this lesson to heart. It's a great opportunity to deliver a coherent regional policy that ensures all regional Australians have access to really good government service. It will, hopefully, the task force will focus on the budget that's coming up. Hopefully the budget will deliver our long-for-asked budget impact statements as part of that private members bill I moved called the Charter of Budget Honesty, calling on the government to actually, if you're making changes that impact on rural and regional Australia, come and tell us first how it's going to affect. Do the money, do the economics. Don't do that last. Let us understand how the budget is actually a budget that includes rural and regional Australia in its planning and design. So I'm really hoping that the ministerial task force takes a look at that legislation, and when we get the budget in May, it's got really clear financial indicators of how budget measures are going to grow, because ideally that will be the case, rural and regional Australia. In October 1999, the Honourable John Anderson hosted a Regional Australia Summit here in Parliament House, and I had the real pleasure of being here. And as a result of that summit, John Anderson set up the Regional Women's Advisory Council. So could I really encourage the government to take a leaf out of the book of the past members of the National Party in this case? It worked, that summit. It did really good relationship buildings. It created task force. It created a combined, bipartisan approach to policy. So can I ask the Regional Ministerial Task Force, if it does nothing else, could it call another summit? Could we invite John Anderson back? Could he get him coming here in Parliament and telling us what he did that worked so well? He was an outstanding minister, and he delivered such great things for rural and regional Australia. And we've got a real opportunity now to do that same sort of thing again, and not put us back into the wilderness of coming into the Parliament and having these really scrappy debates about childcare. It should be at such a higher level, and we should be able to build our trust together and not be arguing through letters to the paper about what doesn't work. So, in bringing my comments to a close, I will say how disappointed I am. I'm really disappointed in the politics of this. We deserved better. I'm sorry the minister hasn't been able to come to the table and deliver for Aboriginal families and for us in rural and regional areas. We will continue to work with you on the guidelines to make the best we can out of that. We will continue to ask for statistics to come back into Parliament so that we can get a real sense of how this program is actually rolling out, and then we will work to make the amendments we can in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to meeting with you, Minister, and working out how we can make the best out of this very poor circumstance.